everyone will enjoy this, but I mean, all our other programs to fit this theme are really about the oceans, ocean life, you know, preserving corals and everything. And I decided to do a total different take on it because, I mean, part of the story is that for thousands of years, people have traveled on the surface of the ocean. And so basically, we have to go through a whole bunch of things. And I mean, I really wanted to spend a little more time in the age of sail. There were so many exciting things they were doing, but there was so much development as the world moved faster and things. We invented telegraph, we invented telephone, we invented radio. It just started moving and things at a faster pace. And I mean, really, a good part of the story is basically the 19th to 20th century and how sea travel, transatlantic travel developed and how it got better. In fact, one of the slides actually talks a quote from Charles Dickens, who took a very early ocean liner. Yeah, a very early ocean liner trip in 1842 to the United States. And he wrote a book about American coast, which people absorb him in because he didn't really get here in the States. And he did have rather sassy delivery, and you'll see. But so crossings, oceans of possibility, technology. All right, first the age of sail, and you could see literally 1,000 years of the kinds of ships that people have used. And of course, the first seagoing vessel was probably a log. Now, this is some of the things they were able to do. I mean, the Greeks and Romans, they knew where Britain was. They could sail from Italy, and they traded extensively in the Middle East. Britain was a colony, Roman colony, for several hundred years. And Viking longships sailed to present-day Canada around the year 1000, and they know that because they left behind a settlement. The foundations are there in Newfoundland. Anytime you want to go up and see them, and there's something even more exciting. They found out recently that there are presently living people in the nation of Iceland who have Native American DNA. That's brand new. Just a couple of months ago, they revealed this. And in the Middle Ages, they invented interesting techniques. One of them was to build it like you would build a house. You built the frame first and then attached all the outside planking. And because the Viking longships were actually each log plank went into the other. They called it clinker built. So they really didn't have much of a frame. So it was totally different. But the ships weren't that big. And so they were able to build bigger ships. And of course, that's important because they not only carried people, they carried cargo. And so you have to have payload, you have to have, and that's what the whole thing is all about. Now, some of the navigation devices, they had compasses, sextants. They were able to get to Asia, sailing around Africa. They were able to get to the New World. And so they could really do a lot, 400 or 500 years ago. Now, here's the beginning of a new era, although I don't think people at the time thought so. This was the first steam-powered wagon invented in France in the 1790s by a man named Cousineau. And nobody saw a relation to ships yet, but it proved that steam could make something move without being pulled by horses. And so you can see in the 19th century, as early as 1818, there actually was an American-built steamship that crossed the Atlantic Ocean, but it actually was a failure because they needed so much space for the engines and the coal to make the steam. And also, people were a little leery about traveling on this because, I mean, nobody liked sailing across the Atlantic on a sailing ship, but it was something everyone knew. And the average voyage could be about 7 weeks. So, and that's it. It depended on the weather too. And actually, even as late as the 19th century, if you ever have some European immigrants who came over in like 1870s, 80s, when they came over sort of indicates their personal worth, because the people who came over between October and April were the winter crossing people, and they had less money than the people who were able to come over between, May and September. Like my great grandfather came from Ireland in June, so that meant he had a little more money than some other people because the winter crossings took longer, they were more dangerous, they were more unpleasant, and it wasn't really easy. But just to give you an idea how slow everything moved by sail in comparison to what happened later, on December 24th, 1814 in Brussels, John Quincy Adams, representing the United States, concluded a treaty with Great Britain that ended the War of 1812. On January 8th, just 2 weeks later, Andrew Jackson fought a major battle in New Orleans with the British Army that was totally unnecessary, but nobody knew the war was over yet. It wasn't until February that everyone found out. And it turned out to be a resounding victory for the Americans. And but of course, even if the British won, they would have had to give it back anyway. And so finally, it took some more tinkering, and by 1838, they were able, 2 ships from Britain actually broke the steam barrier. That's like, they were able to successfully transport people and goods across the Atlantic. And this gave Britain a hammerlock, literally, on the transatlantic trade, which America was always trying to play catch up. And basically, the major players for the rest of the century were European. It was the English, the French, the Germans, and they were all trying to build bigger and better and faster ships to keep going. But one of the people that I mentioned here was Brunel, and you're gonna hear a little more about him because he bit off much more than he or society at the time could chew, and we'll see. And one of the innovations in a steam power ship was the bridge. They needed a platform so you could cross from one paddle wheel to the other. And because before that, in the sail, if you see in the movies and on television, the nerve center of the ship is really in the stern where the wheel is. So everything had to be moved to basically bow of the ship. And but that's where it started. That's where so if you've seen Titanic and everything, that's how the bridges looked at first. This is really, really funny. This is American Notes by Charles Dickens. He wrote in 1842, and this is how he described his cabin. That I do verily believe that deducting the 2 berths, one above the other, and which nothing smaller for sleeping in was ever made coffins. And this is really funny. He was on the Britannia, which was the Cunard Line's first steamship. And basically, it showed they had a long way to go. And I'll to show you how he described it, that it was no bigger than one of those hackney cabriolets, which have the door behind and shoot their fares out like sacks of coals upon the pavement. Before descending into the bowels of the ship, we had passed from the deck into a long, narrow apartment, not unlike a giant hearse with windows in the sides, having at the upper end a melancholy stove, while on either side, extending down its whole dreary length, was a long, long table over which a rack fixed to the low roof and stuck full of drinking glasses and cruet stands hinted dismally at rolling seas and heavy weather. That I had not at that time seen the ideal presentiment of this chamber, which was since gratified me so much. But I observed that one of our friends who had made the arrangements for our voyage turned pale on entering, retreated on the friend behind them, smote his forehead involuntarily, and said below his breath, "Impossible, it cannot be," or words to that effect. He recovered himself, however, by a great effort, and after a preparatory cough or two, cried with a ghastly smile, which is still before me, looking at the same time round the walls, "Ah, the breakfast room steward, eh?" So that's how it was like to travel in the 1840s. And here we go to Brunel. His name is Kingdom Isambard Brunel. And he wanted to build the most ambitious steam packet that anyone ever devised. And he's actually posed in front of the anchor chains of his ship called the Great Eastern. And this gives you an idea of the scale of this ship. It could literally carry 1,000 people, which was absolutely unheard of at the time. And it caused a lot of problems for him. And like here, this gives you a better idea. It was so huge that it could literally travel from Britain to India without refueling, about basically halfway around the world. That's how much space it had. And but it never was an easy thing. It took months to launch it. And it failed. Tide wasn't high enough. It was too heavy. The machinery to drag it into the water. I mean, they had the worst kind. And of course, this was very expensive. So the expenses were going up on a ship that wasn't paying passengers. And this was their propeller, their design. They were still using paddle wheels, but this was a major innovation because they could actually now have paddle wheels and propellers. And that was the next major development, which ships still use. And this was their salon. This was considerably better than what Dickens had described. And it actually, compared favorably to many hotels on the mainland. Yeah. It was iron. Yeah. And of course, the very first ones were wooden ships, and which makes sense because if you notice, the very first automobiles in the 1890s were made from carriage bodies, so they looked very carriage-like. It took a while to sort of change it all over. And this was really the Great Eastern's finest hour because they were never able to get the kind of payload and passengers and cargo to make it pay. And so it had a very short passenger life, 1858 to 1865, and it literally killed Brunel because, I mean, he called the ship his Great Babe, and he literally had a stroke, and which he never recovered from because of all the worry and trying to get the ship launched and make it work. It was just too much too soon. And this is the end. By the 1880s, this is a very satirical cartoon. You could describing all these different things on the ship: animal acts, casinos, restaurants, ladies' emporiums, and everything. And finally, it ran aground, and it took months just to dismantle it. So it was basically a failure from beginning to end. But it hinted at what was to come. Now, here's an American competitor called the Collins Line, and they had an ambitious program. They were trying to beat Cunard, which had the United States mail contract, and they actually managed to win it from Cunard because their ships were making the crossings much, much faster. And there was a reason why, because they didn't slow down for anything. They just charged ahead. And in this case, with the Arctic, they actually struck a smaller French steam schooner, which ironically survived and actually rescued people from the Arctic. And it was a real disaster in more ways than one, because, for instance, the crew mutinied and took to the boats, and there were only 16 of them, leaving the passengers to ship for themselves. And out of the 449 people aboard, only 78 survived. Only 29 of them were passengers, and no women, no children survived. And this is the kind of life-saving equipment they had. And this thing was supposed to be a life preserver. It was actually hard rubber filled with air and like a vacuum, and theoretically it was supposed to keep you afloat, but it didn't. And I got this from a book called The Sea Shall Embrace Them. If you ever run across it, it's an excellent thing. But this literally was almost the Titanic of the middle of the 19th century. And I mean, this was a major blow to the Collins Line. When a few years later, when the Pacific also foundered, I mean, they just lost two of their ships, and it was just hopeless. They lost the mail contract, which they needed to keep the company going. And they also ran into the panic of 1857 financially. I mean, I know we're all a little nervous about what the stock market was doing down. You should have seen what happened in 1857. And as you know, it still was a little spare. This is a Salon, typical ocean liner, 1860s, 1870s, maybe a little bit better than Dickens' time, but it still, quite wasn't there yet. And this was actually from Harper's Monthly Magazine for August 1870. So that's where I got it from. And this is a typical stateroom, and certainly sounded better than what Dickens described. You see, it's got a little sink, and the berths are there, and you could do it. Even today on these huge cruise ships, because we were just on one in April, the rooms are smaller than an average hotel room on land. I mean, they're very compact. Like, they had a wall unit, they had a refrigerator, had some drawers. Right beside it was a writing desk. I mean, it was really, they know how to put these things together. And now, of course, this was one of the major things involving ships. They needed coal, which was a very bad, fossil fuel. As you see, we are still struggling with that. And so the Olympic burned 3,000 tons of coal on her maiden voyage to New York. That turned out to be 620 tons of coal a day. And when they got here, they had a little over 1,000 tons left. They didn't even have enough to go back. They would have to refuel. And we'll hear a little more about the Olympic later. Now, of course, things were getting better. The ships were getting bigger, the ships were getting safer, but they still had some problems. And this happened where, I mean, sometimes ships then collided with small sailing schooners like fishing boats or something because they just didn't see them. And they didn't have, most of these ships didn't have proper lights or anything to let the people know that they were there. And that's what happened to Oregon. And it actually wound up sinking. And the ship in the distance is the Fulda, which was a Hamburg American liner who just happened to be passing by. And of course, there was still no way to communicate with other ships. So if the Fulda hadn't turned up, they would have been in bad shape. This is actually a newspaper, and said the hole begins 12 feet below the main deck and extends downwards for 6 feet with a width of 3.5 feet. And that was enough to sink it. And a ship of that type generally carried, well, the Arctic carried 449 people. These ships could do closer to about 800. And that was going to mean something a little later, and you'll see. Now, as the years progressed, there was more and more travel, and White Star, they really made this bold move in 1889 with the Majestic, and they were fighting its arch rival Cunard, and actually they had this niche. White Star tended to be maybe not as fast, but more luxurious, and Cunard tended to be more businesslike, not as fancy or ornate, but they got you there. So their thing was regular punctual service. But you can see what a great improvement it was over the ship in 1870. And that's really not very long, it's less than 20 years. And this is the kind of engines, and this was literally something, this was big thing. I mean, everybody was racing to try and get these faster ships, bigger and faster ships. And the reason why was not only they could carry more cargo, but they could carry more passengers. And what they really wanted was the immigrant trade. People and some immigrants could actually count the smokestacks because they figured the ones with the most stacks would get them there to America faster. And it literally cost roughly about $75 for a one-way steer. So it was very lucrative. Just think, you're paying for yourself, you're paying for your wife, you're paying for your children. That's why many immigrants, the man came over first, and the woman and the children came over a year or so later. And but it's actually affected basically sort of international relations because Britain and Germany were really getting very irritated at each other, not only because of the passenger ships trying to outdo each other, but also they were building naval power. Like a tremendous insult and shock to the Germans was when the British built a ship in 1906 called the Dreadnought, and it was so immense at the time that even today, if you look up on the internet about, like American naval ships or British naval ships, any naval ships of that period, a lot of websites will identify a ship as pre-dreadnought or post-dreadnought. That's how much it literally became a marker for its time. Now, this gives you an idea. This is 12 years. This is the Oceanic in China, and this is the Olympic on the right. And I really like the Oceanic because this is the ship that brought my great grandmother to America in 1901. And at the time, it was the fastest ship. It was also the first ship to match the Great Eastern's tonnage. So it took literally 50 years to have something of the same kind of tonnage and size that the Great Eastern had. And look how dwarfed it is by the Olympic. And of course, the Titanic was in the literal image. I mean, there were some minor changes. I think the biggest difference was that the Titanic had part of one deck partially enclosed and the Olympic didn't. Otherwise, furnishings, everything was exactly the same. And, okay, now I got this off the internet. There is a record of all the ships that were the fastest, and they all broke what they call the blue riband to make the fastest crossing across the Atlantic. And these are all different, like with the Oregon broke it a couple of times. Let's see, the Deutschland, the Lusitania, the Mauritania, you know, so all of them in one way or another had achieved the fastest speeds. And I mean, people were so taken with ocean liners. This is actually a stage set for a 1902 rom-com called The Stubbornness of Geraldine. And the story doesn't look like much. In this scene, this European roue type is trying to lure this American girl, and that they'll force it, Geraldine. But look at the set. I mean, this was photographed by the Byron Studios, who made, they literally did decades of stage sets for New York, and that's why we have that. But I mean, that took a lot of work to make that just for one scene. And here we go to the Olympic class. This shows you how big these ships were. I mean, and when you compare it to like the Oceanic and the Oregon before that, I mean, they were getting really, really, and this is a very popular illustration. This shows you the ship exceeded all the highest places in the New World and the Old World. And this shows you some of the problems they were having. This actually happened between the Olympic and the Hawk, which was a British naval cruiser who was just passing by. And the propellers, as you saw, three big propellers were so huge and so powerful, they literally sucked the hapless Hawk, which collided with the Olympic. And I mean, they were able to be repaired, but it took us several months, as you can see, to put the Hawk back into service. And I think the Olympic was out for a couple of weeks. So, I mean, it's no great harm done, but it just shows you that the technology and the competitiveness was outstripping all the laws and regulations meant for safety at sea. And we are going to see that. But the lure of the immigrant thing, like for instance, according to Ellis Island, 25 million people came through Ellis Island between 1892 and 1924. And I mean, they wanted those people, they wanted that money. Most of the people on ships at that period were actually steerage, third class. And so the other people paid a lot more. Like on the Titanic and the Olympic, you could have your own private drawing room on a deck off your main room, and that cost $1,911 for one crossing. That was a huge amount of money. And I mean, in order to keep up, New York City had to build these new longer piers on the Hudson River, which in city limits is known as North River. And they were called the Chelsea Piers because they were just on the border of a neighbor known as Chelsea. And I mean, they had to be very long and very modern and everything, and every other New York port. I mean, New York was the biggest, but Boston, Philadelphia, everybody had to do something like that. But the door was shut abruptly in 1924. Congress was rather irritated by the class of immigrants we were getting, which were mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe and the Middle East. And they enacted a whole new series of immigration laws that really pretty much cut down, and it affected uh, ocean travel quite a bit. What a lot of steerage were actually trans actually totally renovated, and they called it, instead of third class, they called it cabin class. So if you didn't mind being in the bowels of the ship, you too could go to Europe and return at a reasonable price. Now, here's one of the things where even though people had confidence in the technology, there's a lot of things they should have done that they didn't. And this is a classic case. The Olympic and the Titanic were equipped with well-in davits, and these davits allowed for up to 4 boats to be transported. And when you lowered them, you stepped into the first boat, and then you stepped into the second, and you stepped into the third. Now, all they needed were 1 extra boats in these davits, and everyone could have been saved. That one thing cost 1,500 lives because they didn't have enough boats. They only had 16 wooden boats and 4 collapsibles, and only 2 of them left the ship. And one of them, they couldn't get the sides up, the canvas sides, so they were rowing in water for several hours with chilling water up to their knees. And the other one was even worse. It was completely overturned. And in order to stay on and survive, the officer, like Toller, had to tell the men to either step to the right, step to the left, to keep everything steady until the Carpathia got there to rescue them. And it would have made all the difference in the world. Now here's their Marconi room, and that people thought, oh, we can communicate, we're in trouble with another ship. And yeah, they could, but nobody was near enough to actually get there in time. The closest ship was the Carpathia, and they were 58 nautical miles away, and their fastest speed was 19 knots, which is roughly about 20 miles per hour. And it was just, they just couldn't get there. This time there was no Fulda who happened to come upon them. So that's a lesson for our times. You could say theoretically the technology is foolproof, but it never is. Now, that didn't stop anyone after a lot of these ships drafted into service for World War I. In fact, the Olympic was coated with something, innovation at the time called dazzle paint. And these were bold geometric, multicolored things on the sides of the ship to confuse German submarines. And when the war was over, they started to come back into service, and they were building newer ships. And what they had was they had the Normandy, they had the Bremen, and these were all ships trying to catch that market because they couldn't do the immigrants so much anymore. But there were a lot of Americans who were really, really hungry to see Europe. And this is the first class dining room of the Normandy. It was built, I mean, the finest art and architecture of the what they called the modern period, which we call Art Deco, which came around in the 70s, the term. And you see what a difference it is than what Dickens described. In fact, actually, the Normandy came to a very bad end when World War II happened. they were still in New York and they were interned and they were trying to convert it to a troop ship called the Lafayette. And a lot of these ships, like my father, was transported to Europe on the Queen Mary as a troop ship. I actually have a picture of him getting a haircut aboard ship. It's so cool. And so all of this stuff had to be taken out. And this is where the bad end part happened. They had a fire and they poured so much water into the ship that it actually tipped over onto its side in the pier in the river. And there was just nothing they could do except scrap it. So a lot of the stuff was warehouse, like the tables, silverware, all this stuff, and it was all sold. And actually, I worked around the corner from a church in Brooklyn Heights, and they have the doors from the salon. Those are their front doors in this church. Now, competition on the horizon. Now, originally ocean liners were worried about dirigibles because the Germans were doing well. They were traveling all over Europe. They were traveling to America. And by the 1930s, they had literally logged 1 million passenger miles without a single fatality until 1937, when the Hindenburg exploded in Lakehurst, New Jersey. And I mean, even though most of the people survived, it's between that and the British had one called the R101, which actually got no further than France and crashed. I mean, it just was a dead end. And so this is where Pan Am comes in. They decided with their flying clippers, that's what they called them, they could actually take off and get to Europe. And that's what they did in 1939. But what happened was that they had about maybe 20 people aboard, and it cost $675 round trip, which sounds really good, but those are 1939 dollars. If you tried, this would be equivalent of $4,300 today to do this. And it turned out to be successful. I mean, enough that it was definitely worth it. And I think the shipping companies didn't realize how much of a threat this was to them. But because they were still going gangbusters, because my father worked for the United States Lines and Security, and he knew all these famous people from the 1950s and 60s because he generally met them. He knew the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who had actually abandoned the Queen Elizabeth because they liked the United States better. And we'll get to the United States in a minute. But now, this is another threat. By 1946, they were able to have a direct service between New York's LaGuardia Airport, and they flew to London. About 100. They flew to actually Heathrow wasn't there yet, but they flew to another airport that was 100 miles from London. They spent 12 hours in the air out of 15, and they flew from New York to Gander, Newfoundland, and from there they flew to Iceland, and from there they got to Scotland, and then they finished near London. But it proved it could be done, and it was a lot faster. You literally could get to Europe in one day and get back in Europe. And I think one of the things that really facilitated this was that, I mean, Europe was in ruins, and we had the Marshall Plan, and a lot of Americans had to go over and do business. The United Nations first met in London in 1946, and it became more urgent to travel more swiftly between Europe and America. And I think that definitely gave it a real push. Now, here's another major post-war development, was radar. And as again with Morse and Marconi, it had its limits, and we'll see. This is what radar couldn't prevent. It couldn't prevent the collision between the Swedish cargo ship, the Stockholm, and the Italian liner Andrea Doria. And the Doria actually sank, and the Ile de France, which had been built in 1925, like the Fulda, before it actually happened on the scene, they were close enough, and they did heroic work trying to get passengers off the Andrea Doria, because the ships on the port side couldn't, the boats could not be launched. Everything had to be launched from the starboard side, which was sinking. That was the side that the ship was listing. And I mean, it was really, I mean, they were in imminent danger of the ship just suddenly rolling over on top of everybody. And as you see, the only reason why the Stockholm survived was that, being a ship built for the northern waters, they actually had a reinforced bow to cut through ice. And I can add something even a little more personal. Yeah, they did. They had radar, they had radio, and apparently the collision happened because both ships tried to pass each other on the starboard side because it was foggy. And it's, the whole thing has been disputed ever since. Both captains said they were in the right. Nobody would admit to being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But and that was a brand new ship. It was launched, I think, in 1952. So it only actually had like 4 years of service. And it was really beautiful. I've seen pictures of the interior, the staterooms and everything. And yeah, but this is where the personal part comes in. I was 5.5 when that happened. And a lot of people in my Brooklyn neighborhood actually worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and that's where they took the Stockholm. So they just loaded all of its kids in the car and took us down to the thing. I mean, you know, and here we were standing there in the middle. It was like, you know, it was dark. I don't remember what time it is, but it was pretty dark. And it was just amazing to see, you know, it was just this big open hole where the bow was supposed to be. You literally could see people crossing back and forth, construction men in hard hats and rigging lights and everything to try and repair the ship. It was just unbelievable. Now here's where we tried to fight back. This is a famous picture. At the top is the SS United States, and it's actually passing its earlier sister ship, the America. Both were designed by the same architect. And since my father worked for the company, I was over, me and my sister were over every inch of these ships, and they were something else. And in order to cope with the post-war traffic and compete, they didn't have the fancy trappings. Actually, up to the America, which was built in 1939, really sort of had the more traditional, they had the wainscoting and everything. Whereas the United States, everything was steel, plastic. There were only 2 pieces of wood on the entire ship: a piano in the first class lounge and a butcher's block in the kitchen. They were built for speed, and they were the only passenger ship. They still hold blue ribbon for the fastest time. They crossed the Atlantic in 4 days and like 22 minutes. But even then, you know, you can't fight airplane. And of course, traffic started with propeller planes. It was going to get even worse for them. But you know, this is how fast it could go. It could go 38 knots, about 44 miles per hour. And there's this wonderful picture. I remember the captain telling us that in your sea trials, it went 19 knots, about 20 miles per hour, in reverse. They actually took a picture from the bridge showing a wake from the bow. I mean, it was just insane. But it's the ocean liner's time had passed. But while it lasted, this was the Aztec Lounge, which was famous. All the fancy people, they went there and they had great dining rooms there. But you can see what I mean. There's no wood. And it still exists. It's more than Philadelphia. There are quite a few efforts to say that one of the schemes, which I hope they can do, is to make it like the Queen Mary in Long Beach in LA, to make it sort of a hotel, retail, convention center. And because everyone says, the engineers say the hull is sound. I mean, if they just need somebody to put the money in, and the reason why it was so fast, according to what they told me, because I saw the fabled engine room. Actually, they had two engine rooms. They were both sealed off, so if something happened, like a torpedo, they still had power. And this was a government secret. A lot of U.S. taxpayers' dollars went into building that. I was not supposed to be there. Neither was my sister. But I mean, what? I mean, we couldn't be in a position to really blow the thing up, could we? But it was just one of the innovations they learned of how to do during World War II. And the engines were so powerful because when World War II ended, President Truman canceled an order for an aircraft carrier, but the engines had been built and they were saved and put on the United States. And that's why nobody could beat it in the water. Now, here's a further of the jet age. And on this side is what they call the de Havilland Comet. And on this side is a Boeing 707. And the de Havilland Comet, it was the first jet airliner, and it was a huge success at first, but several of their planes crashed, causing great loss of life. And the reason why is that their bodies could not handle the stress of moving at that speed. I mean, this is a jet aircraft was still very new, and these were the biggest jet aircraft ever made, because before that they were just fighter planes, which were a lot easier to deal with. And so Boeing learned a lot from the Comet, but the Comet wasn't first. But instead of spending 12 hours to fly the Atlantic, you could do it, I think the average, well, I just came off of one from Spain to the United States, and that was 9 hours and 30 minutes. So, you could do that. I mean, we took a ship over, we cruised over that. We were 13 days at sea. But of course, they weren't trying to race across like other ships have done. They just sort of try to give you a more leisurely trip. After all, you are on vacation. And this is the ship we were on, the Celebrity Reflection. It was built in 2012. The cabins are 15 stories high. It's a very sturdy ship. They somehow have managed to make it work. And this is one of the most latest designs to have GPS, satellite GPS technology, and they know where they are and everything. I mean, they actually had a program called, Meet the Ship's Officers, and they explained how the ship works. They went through great detail explaining how waste is handled, how water is recycled. I mean, it's just, and the captain told us that it cost $800,000 in the Azores to refuel. Because that was our first port of call. The Azores happen to be over 1,000 miles from the mainland, so we still had quite a ways to go before we got to Rome. So we stopped for one day in the Azores and took a great tour. That is one of the loveliest spots I've ever seen. If you can get there, and they do have an international airport, try to do that. Next was Las Palmas in, Mallorca, down to Spain. The next was Toulon in France. And the next was Livorno, which is near Florence. So we spent a day in Florence. And then finally we got to Rome. So this is the end of our saga here. This happens to be the Lusitania sailing into New York. And that's another thing you don't see. You see, back then they had to have these little boats, tugs, to sort of nudge it towards the dock. I mean, I can tell you, they don't need them anymore. They just go right into the dock. And one of the ways they can do that is that the bridge has wings on both sides where they actually have controls. So somebody, the pilot, can have a much better view than traditionally they were able to do. And so they really don't need these little tugboats. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this program. I am open to comments or questions, and thank you for coming.